is the interview where we go beyond the headlines to understand what's really going on by asking some of the esoteric questions that reveal more of the truth. The Trump administration is demanding states undo full SNAP benefits paid out under judges' orders last week. The Supreme Court has stayed those rulings, but this is a legal tete-a-tete that has 42 million Americans, including 1.4 million here in Michigan, caught and in administrative stasis. Joining me now is Ron Zambrano, an attorney who can walk us through the constitutional questions here. Thank you so much, Mr. Zambrano, for being with us. So when you look at the order from the USDA, essentially from the Trump administration, is this legally right? And what sort of statutory guidelines is the Trump administration likely drawing on?
With regards to the money that's already paid out, for those states that paid out that money to those that needed it in their individual states, up until the point that the order was by Ketanji Jackson, Justice Jackson, was paused, those are technically following the law. If for somehow the Trump administration can splice through wires of money that happen afterwards, then those would be unauthorized. But I imagine most of this is before the very late night Friday order from Justice Jackson.
So this is an entitlement, you could say, and that's in some ways the Trump administration inserting itself and saying that now that money has to be rolled back. It makes it somewhat discretionary. Do you read it that way?
No, because there was an order from the lower courts because to use the contingency fund to fund these benefits for SNAP. So SNAP, as of right now, is a law of the land as far as being appropriated and something that's existed since the 1930s to help families that cannot afford to feed themselves, at least from a nutritional standpoint. So when the Trump administration is saying, well, you got to roll this back, well, they don't, because the courts at that point, up until Justice Jackson said to stop the payments or to stop funding the payments because it's really distributed by the states, not the federal government, that up until that point, it was quote unquote authorized. But there have been many reports that states have been finding funding for themselves and then hoping that they would later be reimbursed.
Yeah, but obviously the Trump administration is saying that these funds need to be rolled back for some reason. So they have to believe that they have some legal standing. You're saying that they have none at all, but they're clearly trying to fight it. Is that how I should understand it? Yeah,
unless there is a payment that came out after the Justice Jackson's pausing the order, those are lawful. So to the extent the Trump administration is saying, well, you got to roll everything back anyways, that there's no legal standing for that. That is money that it was authorized up until that point. Those don't have to be rolled back. Those Americans that got that money don't have to worry about paying it back, and the states don't have to worry about paying it back. Anyway, this is really something that's trying to be used for purposes of negotiations in the larger shutdown.
And that's exactly what I was going to get to. How do you see this being used politically if in fact you're saying that legally there will be no result to the order made by the USDA?
Well, on this issue, to the extent it's trying to be used for a negotiating tactic or some type of pressure point, it's a bark without bite. This money's out. It's really the future funds that is at stake. And to the extent this is being used to force votes on a current plan that would no longer give subsidies to the Affordable Care Act in the marketplace, that's really what this is all about. The Democrats don't want to vote on that because they will never vote to not have subsidies for the larger Affordable Care Act marketplace. And somehow the Trump administration has said, well, we're going to point out that SNAP benefits won't be funded until there is a vote. It's an interesting tactical decision on the Trump administration to point to whether or not people can eat to get his political will done.
What about the idea that the Trump administration and the USDA could say we are totally constrained by the Appropriations Act, and therefore we can look to the ADA, the Anti-Deficiency Act, and say that this money wasn't necessarily appropriated. It's in a contingency fund, and therefore it's a violation of existing law for us to allocate this money that Congress hasn't specifically set aside for SNAP benefits. Couldn't the Trump administration legally and maybe cogently make that argument?
They are making that argument, and it is a cogent argument. I don't think from a legal perspective, from an academic standpoint, for those of us in the legal profession, it's not out of line in a certain extent. It's more of a whether or not there's a will to fund a program that feeds 42 million people when a judge, a lower court judge, has already ordered that you should use the contingency funds because a couple dozen Democratic attorney generals have said that those funds should be used because there's precedent for that. So although there is, from a legal standpoint, two sides to the story, there is already a precedent to use these contingency funds. Two judges have ordered that those funds be used. So to continue the fight is an interesting decision from a tactical perspective. Again, this is all really a part of a larger negotiations for purposes of voting to reopen the government.
Yeah, and it does appear that the posture from the DOJ is already that the Rhode Island ruling, that there is no standing there for the judge to intervene in this particular matter because of the appropriations clause. That seems to already be the framing. So maybe there would be success. It's possible, it sounds like.
Right. So that's another separate fund that's very unique to the ADA the USDA. So there is precedent. I think that's what Justice Jackson, was really pointing to, that this really needs to be figured out for purposes of what is authorized by statute, by the legislature. This is not something that is, just some public fund that people can dip into or not. These are appropriated things in very specific bills. So there is a contingency fund, there's a separate fund through the USDA that the Rhode Island judge was pointing to, and I think that's where it may be rolled back, because that was new.
And could they also cite Office of Personnel v. Richmond from 1990, potentially, to say, look, here in that case, the U.S. government wasn't allowed to allocate money that wasn't specifically set aside. So there is clearly some legal precedent here that the administration can lean on. I'm trying to understand how realistic it is that this money could be rolled back. I mean, they could point to precedent like that and possibly see some judge maybe overturn or side with them.
No, that's a very good citation. It's a very good argument to the citation. The problem is this: to the extent there's a desire or an expectation that these monies will be given back, it won't be given back. The argument is that there's discretionary use to the contingency funds, and to not use it. Right now, the argument is that the Trump administration is using it capriciously, not using it capriciously. And that is not enough to override the very compelling interest to feed 42 million Americans. So that is the problem. The problem is it's not so much whether or not he can or can't do it from a technical standpoint. There's a desire to do it, but this money's already been spent. So he's not going to be able to roll it back. This is something that up until that point, the law of the land, up until that point being when Justice Jackson paused these things, this is money that was allowed to be distributed. Now, there's a second thing. What if these monies were not funded by the federal government? The states used their own monies. They found resources somewhere else to feed their individual constituents, just like perhaps in Michigan or in California where I am. That money doesn't get rolled back because they didn't use federal funds to do so, or the contingency funds to do so. So there was a question posed to the Department of Agriculture. Well, what about those funds that didn't use any federal money at all? And there is no response to that, which I think should be a pretty easy answer, is that if the states use their own money to feed their own people, that does not belong to the federal government, regardless of whatever case you cite.
Yeah, no, and look, I just want to realize that there are so many things that in some ways have been unprecedented that we haven't seen necessarily in our lifetime, but that there may be some legal standing to be able to do what the Trump administration is trying to accomplish on a broader scale. Nothing's been tried at this level, to my knowledge, of rolling back this huge of a payment individually across all 50 states. However, things happen. So how long could the fight go on? If the Trump administration, for example, continues to pursue its posture that the Rhode Island order, there is no jurisdiction there, that's something that potentially could get stuck in the weeds for a long time. So I'm wondering how long you believe this will continue between the administration, the USDA, and then various states, including some 25 attorney generals who have joined the fight.
Sure. This will stop when the government is funded, the shutdown ends, and there is no people in the legislative branch do their job and figure out where this money is supposed to come from to feed 42 million Americans.
Yeah.
Up until that point, we were in day 40. Hopefully it doesn't go to 50. But up until that point, this legal battle, just like you were describing, is a very unprecedented battle that will rage on until the Supreme Court makes a decision as to who is right and who is wrong. And then hopefully that the executive branch will listen to what may be an adverse decision to its interests.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and obviously once the government shutdown ends, everything resumes. But if this government shutdown continues on, obviously not in perpetuity, but for a very long time, it probably feels like that to a lot of people who rely on these benefits. You know, there's no way of knowing in that time if there will be any resolution on SNAP benefits, and it's possible that some of the challenging of rolling the SNAP benefits back and fighting the USDA could be to keep it open until the government shutdown concludes. Do you see that as potentially what the Trump administration is trying to accomplish? Just keep this in sort of a legal limbo as a bargaining chip?
Exactly. It is in what the larger interests of the Trump administration is to use the lack of SNAP funds to force constituents in both, primarily Democratic states, to force their representatives to bend to the Trump administration's will, or maybe not the Trump administration's will, the Republicans' legislature's will, to vote on a bill, pass a bill that would no longer have the subsidies for the health care that is subsidized through the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And if the fight is held up in the courts, where this money is just put in limbo until that decision is made, that is a possible outcome that they're hoping for, they being the Trump administration. Although I believe the states will figure it out somehow, because people are being hungry. There's news out that people are worried not only about feeding themselves, but their pets. College students need these things across, whether you're red or blue. People need these monies to feed themselves, and then why that is a larger conversation. But either whether it's the GOP or the Trump administration, they feel that this fight is going to lead to this ultimate goal, which is to no longer subsidize the Affordable Care Act.
Let's talk about what we're seeing on the aviation front. The FAA obviously has had to deal with this government shutdown. We've seen delays across the country. A lot of travelers are frustrated by this. And you could make an argument that it's also a safety concern because of federal regulators that may not be engaged in the same type of way because of the government shutdown. What do you see there as the biggest concern?
I believe it is a safety issue. We don't know how, to the extent that there is a cut down in people being processed through flights, that's its own safety issue through TSA. To the extent we need people, the flight operators and the towers to make sure planes aren't near each other. This is a huge safety issue and a stress in an already stressful event. No one likes to travel. No one says traveling is the most stress-free experience. And now you're putting this huge amount of pressure on people that are already in a very stressful situation. And now you have people that have spent money that can't be on flights. The holidays are coming up. It's not far away. We're already in November. This is going to be, if this does not get resolved soon and the holiday period comes in, I cannot imagine the amount of outcry that's going to be.
Yeah, the directive has been to reduce by the FAA air traffic between 10% and 40%. Obviously, that's kind of a rolling figure. And we've seen a surge in call-outs. And all it takes is maybe some corner being cut or not having the adequate staff. And we could be looking at a disaster. Does this in some ways expose a certain fragility? That FAA funding, for example, is based on yearly appropriations. Maybe this isn't something we should do annually. Should it be set aside because the regulatory nature is so tied to direct safety of passengers?
You make a great point when it comes to anything having to do with safety and also people traveling across state lines or international lines. That should be such a high priority for purposes of making sure the underlying staff and systems are well funded so that, one, they're safe, and two, operating in a very functional way. We should not have to worry yearly whether or not millions upon millions of Americans and also people visiting this country to spend money in the United States will even get here. I believe you've made a great point that we should either have separate funding that's done on a less frequent basis, or maybe they should have their own contingency fund that they can get into when there is a government shutdown. And hopefully we never have a government shutdown that goes this long. We're already at 40 days, but you make a great point, I believe, and I agree with you that funding something so vital for really the American economy and the American experience to travel between states and abroad should not be something that's held captive every year.
Yeah, and to be fair, I'm always just someone who wants to put out possible solutions to the problem. I'm not saying that that's necessarily is a solution, or that it's my opinion that that's what we should do, but it is something I think people would ask. Folks have to travel even when there is a government shutdown, and this is one of those areas like eating. It's a basic need to be able to move from one place to another, and it's being curtailed, obviously, by what's happening in Washington and the political games that continue to be played. I want to ask you about what you think the necessary, and I know I'm asking you more of a political question as opposed to a legal one, so forgive me for that, but what you think needs to happen here to see this government shutdown come to an end?
Well, from a total ending of the government shutdown, there has to be some type of real compromise on both sides for things that are apparently deal breakers. On the Democratic side is you cannot touch the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. And on the Democratic side is like, no, we have to get rid of them. There has to be, people have to talk to each other, which is one of the rare good things that both sides agree is good thing from the filibuster. The filibuster requires them to talk. And now I hope that they talk in a way where there's a compromise, and there are brilliant people at those levels that hopefully they can come up with a compromise where maybe what's being floated around is that the subsidies will be extended, but there will be different qualifications for the individuals who get them, or that they get credits just like they were getting credits in COVID-19. And at least those conversations are happening. But if nobody decides to reach out and take a risk to compromise and propose something, there is going to be a continuing deadlock of the government. So, and this is what we used to do. We used to talk to each other and compromise, because at the end of the day, we all want healthcare. We all want food on our tables. We all want to be able to get on a plane and feel safe. It's just a matter of how we get to those things. And I can't imagine that we can't find a middle ground to find those.
We're at the point that it's possible that you might see individuals, maybe even class action lawsuits, where the government shutdown has affected them. I mean, you could say this about people who are concerned about feeding their families under SNAP as a result of this lack of congressional appropriations, because of, you could argue, the misfeasance of the federal government. Even extending that argument, there's probably a reasonable argument to be made that even the DOT and the FAA could be sued because they act as arms of the federal government. And if it falls within waiver limits, maybe say under the Tucker Act, that you could see airlines suing the federal government, saying we lost millions of dollars during this government shutdown because of your order to scale back flights between 10 to 40% and already thousands of missed flights. Is that something you could see coming here?
Absolutely. And they would do it not with the expectation of getting really making themselves quote unquote whole, but really to fire across the bow to the federal government's like, you guys cannot continue to do this again. This is way beyond what's normal, even for the government shutdowns. At least I've been in the United States since 1979 when I was born, and nothing like that. This is so unprecedented. So to the extent you guys this is now the airlines talking, you guys intend to act like this again, we are going to come after you for the money that we lose. And I think it's fair. We all rely on a certain normalcy and function in basic governments. And if that is not being met, which they know that they need to do their job for us to create jobs, create money, create industry, to travel, then there should be a consequence for not doing their job. There's a consequence for the rest of us not doing our jobs.
Well, also the cancellations, because this is a percentage that the FAA is trying to get, it is arbitrary and capricious for them to say, well, any willy-nilly flight is going to be canceled just because we're trying to get to this deadline because Congress has abdicated its authority and not done what it's supposed to do. So they could be also looking at some administrative and procedural claims. Do you think there are grounds there?
Absolutely. I think to the extent there are procedural and administrative claims directly to the DOT and through the regulating agencies, there's absolutely claims that could be done for purposes of making sure that when decisions are made, just like you pointed out, that it's not just something picked out of a hat. There has to be some type of reasons behind it, data behind it, experts behind it, that there's an effort to do things at least in a mindful way versus, well, I'm waking up today and just picking a number that is capricious. And that is something that under the law, when you act capriciously, just like the Trump administration is being accused of right now with regards to the SNAP benefits and not funding them or trying to claw them back, that when you act capriciously, as far as when you act as a government official, that is against the Constitution with regards to certain things that the citizenry are relying on for purposes of functioning.
Yeah, we've seen a number of ways in which even local municipalities are stepping up and dipping into their own budgets to fill SNAP benefits, going back to SNAP benefits. For example, here in Michigan, Detroit, the mayor of Detroit, which is the largest city in the state, he authorized $1.75 million in SNAP benefits or emergency funding for people who would need SNAP. And I wonder if some of these local municipalities, counties, even the state, if there's a way that they could issue the SNAP benefits themselves using their own money, not just federal funds that were already allocated, and then sue the government to then recoup that money after the government shutdown is over.
So that is what's happening, at least here in California. There are certain municipalities, counties, and the state agencies that are absolutely going to do that, and that they're going to turn around and ask. First, they're going to ask nicely, and if they don't get it, they're going to file in court for reimbursement for purposes of these. Really, they are entitlements for the few hundreds of thousands of Americans here in California that rely on those benefits. And just like to the extent that's happening in Michigan for like the mayor in Detroit, that would be, first you're going to ask nicely through a letter, and if it doesn't happen, they're absolutely, I think, within their rights to ask. You have to. We're doing our job. We rely on you. There's funds appropriated for this up until this point. Please help us feed our citizenry, which you have set up for now we're close to 90 years doing.
Yeah, there's clearly some built-in reimbursable flexibility that states have had historically. I mean, that's true without necessarily violating the ADA, where they can fund something if the federal government is having problems. The question becomes, like, for example, here with what Mayor Duggan is doing, he's authorizing that money specifically going into food banks. So it's not necessarily exactly SNAP benefits, but it's a way to fill the gap as a result of SNAP benefits. Would that money be recuperable, or would it have to be specifically state money paid into SNAP accounts?
From a legal standpoint, it would have to be SNAP accounts being funded in order to ask the federal government for reimbursement of funding SNAP accounts. That is, now, it's a great thing. It's a great public service that money's being put into food banks or whatever social services that exist or private charities that exist that will feed families, especially with Thanksgiving coming in. But I don't think that you, from a legal standpoint, have standing or can say you have standing if you're not actually filling up SNAP accounts to feed the local citizenry. I think that would be a harder one, and I think a judge would throw that out on that specific technical argument.
I wonder, too, from a broader perspective, if this really is a great example of the importance of federalism to some extent, that states are able to take matters into their own hands to literally keep people fed when the federal government isn't able to do what it's supposed to do. And so all of these states sort of less loosely than certainly historically, but still as individual states are able to take on some of that authority and then even demand once the government is back up and running that they be compensated for what they did. Do you think that? I mean, it's terrible what's happening, and it's sad that average Americans are getting stuck in the middle of this. But it is sort of, for those who champion the idea of federalism and having individual states, it seems to work.
It seems to work that there are states that are capable, or cities in your example, capable of grabbing 7 figures worth of money to feed people. The problem is that a lot of states can't do that. A lot of cities cannot do that. A lot of There are failed states in our country, unfortunately, and they are not set up to mobilize as quick as apparently the city of Detroit is, or the city of Los Angeles, or the city of New York, to put food into banks where people can go and line up. And the problem, and I think the counter argument would mean is that in those communities where people need this food the most, they live in communities where that type of mobilization from a functional political standpoint just doesn't happen as quickly as it should. And they need the help from the federal government to step in. The federal government has historically, even in our federalist setup, comes in when sometimes the state doesn't fulfill what it should for its own citizenry. So it's for the folks that live in the poorer states, parts of the South, parts of the Bible Belt, where there just is not a large political, not political, but just organizational structure to feed those folks. Those are the folks that I'm most worried about. I'm not worried about people in the cities. I'm worried about people out in the Great Plains of our country.
Yeah, there are some duties that the executive has, and let's just say the shutdown were to continue on for what probably most people would consider to be an unreasonable period of time. If there is some constitutional conflict between, say, the president wanting to authorize certain payments and authorize certain functions of the government until or before Congress can come to some sort of conclusion, could he do that? Is there a mechanism for him to do that?
Technically, if there are no funds, and unless the judicial branch tells him that he should use other funds, he can technically do that. I don't know how it's going to serve him politically, but he can technically do that. The larger question that I don't think anyone wants to ask is, what happens if the judiciary or the Supreme Court tells him to do something and he balks? Then we have a different problem. But technically, he's right. Right now, we're out of money and there's no money to go. He has a view about, or not him, but those who work for him have a view about the contingency fund, and it's not a ultra wrong position. It's just a position that most, I think, presidents would take. And the states are going, no, there is those funds, you should fund them. So from a legal standpoint in court, he's making, I believe, a good faith argument, but we all know it's a political one. And I think that's the danger for him. So hopefully the Supreme Court will make an order, and whether Trump likes it or not, he will obey that order. And we don't have to ask the one question we've all been asking since about November of last year.
Yeah, and to be clear, as we wrap up here, I'm referencing the constitutional necessity doctrine, where the idea here is that the Constitution shouldn't paralyze itself, that the tenets of the Constitution shouldn't do that. So even though the power of the purse is vested with Congress, if they are unable to come to some sort of conclusion, the executive authority that's vested in the president should be able to allow him to move if this continues on. And I'm asking you, maybe it not be politically wise or savvy, but it could be a solution if we get to the point that, say, the FAA is in serious need, or again, people are going hungry. Should he pull that lever? Can he?
I think he should. Yes, he can. You've made a great point on this doctrine, and he absolutely should, to feed American families. He could just be like, I'm trying to feed you. You may not like it, or you may like it, but you guys should be fed. We'll figure it out later. But I don't want people to go hungry. And I think that'll serve not only him politically, but the 42 million Americans that need these funds to feed themselves.
All right, Ron Zambrano, thank you so much for walking us through some of these constitutional questions, which I know are still outstanding, and who knows how it'll be resolved. We appreciate you taking some time for us on this Sunday afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And all of you out there, we'll be back at 4:30 next week.